microphone at the
Yeah.
back of this.
I'll borrow your phone for a second or something else. Let's scan that.
I'll do it.
You want to record the Rob?
Perfect.
Picture of that time. Yes, we feel my watch.
I actually feel. Oh.
It was an hour behind. I corrected it so for the future we'll have a watch.
Yeah. All right. So without further ado, all right. So right in the beginning of Parashas Kedoshim, so it's Achamas Kedoshim. So there's a lot of mitzvahs in the parasha, but there's one pasuk, one mitzvah when I was looking at the parasha a couple of days ago to prepare. So it just caught my eye. So I figure we'll talk about it. So right in the beginning of Parashas Kedoshim, again, you don't have the pasuk in front of you, but it's right the pasuk dal right in the beginning of the parasha. So it says in pasuk, Al tifnu el halila. Al tifnu el. Don't, literally it's translated as don't turn towards idols. Don't turn towards idols. What does it mean not to turn towards idols? So Rashi Taishas is probably the simple shot, means don't serve idols, in other words, don't turn to them, in other words, don't worship them. Okay? Now that's not anything new. We've had, there's a lot of mitzvahs in Chumash. So we'll go with that theme, don't bow down to them, don't serve them, and so on. So Al Tifnu, don't turn to them, don't serve them in that way. But Chazal, that's what Rashi says, but according to Chazal, there's other interpretations to this pasuk that really define it as a unique, independent mitzvah on its own. Just got started. So the makars that you have in front of you, so we'll go through it together. We're gonna go out of order though. You'll see why Hashem soon. But take a look at Maramuk number 2. So this is a Rambam. In the beginning, it's relatively towards the beginning of Hilchas Avodah Zara. So just to get a little bit of a picture of how the Rambam presents the laws of Avodah Zara. So the first parak in the Rambam is an interesting one. In Hilchas Avodah Zara, he talks about the history of Avodah Zara, how the concept of Avodah Zara evolved. Because you had, I said, it starts from Adam and Chava being created by Hashem. And so obviously there's an awareness of God. So what happened all of a sudden that you would have by Avram Avinu, that the Rebbeinu Shalom was basically forgotten. So the Rambam famously says, Mahalach, that by the generation of Enosh, the world made a very big mistake. That's the language of the Rambam. Toos Gedolah, a very, very big mistake, which is that they figure, listen, God's amazing. God's very, very big and almost impossible to relate to. But we know that He did create these bodies through which He gives, Shefa comes to Rebbeinu Shalom through these things, these intermediaries, Malachim, celestial bodies, these types of things. So they made the cheshbon, let's honor these things. God gave them honor by appointing them in such a high position, so let's honor them. And that itself is honorable to the king if you praise and honor his, the ones that serve him. So that's what they did. Slowly but surely, you forgot about the King of all kings, and it was all focused on these angels and planets and so on, until you have Avodah Zara. That's the Parak Aleph of Rambam. Then he says Avram Avinu came to correct this mistake, and Avram Avinu brought back faith in the Rebbeinu Shalom, and he passed it on to his children and the Shvatim and so on, until we find ourselves in Mitzrayim, where because of the slavery we almost forget about the tradition of Avram Avinu, until Moshe Rabbeinu comes and brings us back and gives us the Torah, and we're able to reconnect to the Emunah of old. That's basically Parak Aleph of Hilchas Avodah Zara. Comes Parak Beis in Hilchas Avodah Zara. So Maramakim 1, 2, and 3 are the first 3 halachas of the second parak. But for our purposes now, we're going to start with halacha Beis. So take with Maramakim number 2 is halacha Beis. It says the Rambam like this, and again, defining for us what this mitzvah, al tifnoli, not to turn towards idolatry. What does that mean to turn towards idolatry? So it says the Rambam. Svarim Rabim Chibru Oivdei Avodas Chachavim Ba'avidasa. There's many books that were written describing idolatry and idolatrous, services. Heichik Avidasa. How would these idols be served? Mama Seha. In their crazy religions, what would these idols do? What would these gods do? Mishpatel. What are the rules and regulations of how to serve these deities? All the textbooks of these other religions. So there's a lot of books out there. It says the Rambam, Tzivona Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Rebbeinu Shalom commanded us, Shaloi Likras Baisanas Farm Klal, not to read these books, V'loi Naharaba, not to think about these subjects, V'loi B'davar Midvareha, not anything about these subjects. So these subjects are off limits. They're first a waste of time, Aleph, And there's an actual prohibition to involve mentally, to engage yourself mentally in these subjects. It says the Rambam more than that, even to gaze upon idols themselves, to study them, to study the figures, and as the commentaries explain, it means to study to even architecturally how they were made. Any level of like mental attachment and like commitment and devotion and energy spent on these things, even if it's just a matter of like focusing like your vision on these things and really studying them, asr. These are all asr shenemar al tifnu alilim. Don't turn towards idols. So turning towards idols means mentally and just like with your time and energy, don't turn towards these, not just the idol itself, but the whole subject matter of idolatry. It's off limits. And similarly, says the Rambam, there's another pasuk which sort of expands on this idea. The pasuk says, that the pasuk says, lest you do this. And so you're not allowed to do the following thing. Tidresh le'leihem, to investigate their gods. Leimar ech yavdu, to say to yourself, how did they do it? In other words, even if you're not trying to learn from these things to do it yourself, but you're just on intellectual curiosity, like what's going on in these ancient religions, or what's going on in even religions of now. So the pasuk says, in other words, that might be a thought that you might have, which it's just something that you're curious about. So the pasuk is saying, don't do that. Don't investigate the service of idolatry, how it was done. Even though you're not trying to investigate for the purposes of your own, experience. Shadavar zeh goyrem, says the Rambam, because even thinking about these things and putting your mind to it is goyrem lifanisa achreha. It, as we'll see soon, it sort of creates a path to serving it. It creates a path. Velas is kamashay nisin, and it might lead to do what these guys are doing. So by thinking about them, by studying about it. Shnemar, and that's what the pasuk says. V'esakin kamani. So it starts off with an instant question of, let me investigate. I'm curious, and it ends up being, let me do it too. So fine. That's what the Rambam says. Well, the last line will end off. We'll see soon. That's the halacha of al tifnu el halilim. Okay. By the way, just to give a little bit of a source, we'll see soon maybe a little more about this, but a little bit of a source that the Rambam threw in over here, that there's not only prohibition to think about these things. By the way, this interpretation of the Rambam, that there's a prohibition of investigating, of reading and studying about these subjects, and it's from al tifnu alilim, that's what it means to turn to idolatry. This is something that the Rambam is not making up. It's coming from the Medrash. So the Medrash, in fact, interprets al tifnu alilim means not to study these subjects. But the Rambam threw in, not only is one prohibited from studying these things, but even looking and gazing and staring at idolatry is also prohibited. That's in fact from a Gemara in Shabbos. If you take a look at Marmuk number 6, so again, we're not going to see all of it yet, but the Gemara says in Shabbos the following thing: Kuf mem tes amid aleph. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbana, you have a brisa. The rabbis taught, Ksav hamahalich tachas hatzura, the tachas hadiyuk nois. If you have a painting or some sort of statue, we'll see in a second what type, but some sort of statue or painting, and there is a writing underneath it. What do they call it when they have like an inscription, like a caption underneath? So says the Brisa, Asal Kreise b'Shabbos. The caption you're not allowed to read on Shabbos. This is a prohibition of reading secular things on Shabbos. That's what the Brisa is talking about. So you can't read captions under paintings or under statues on Shabbos. That's not our subject now. Says the Gemara, V'diyukna atzma, but that's all the caption. And that's something that's okay during the week, but prohibited on Shabbos. But the statue itself, the image itself, af b'chol asar, with a stakel ba. You're not allowed to look at it and stare at it even during the week. Mishum shenem al tifno lila, because it says you're not allowed to turn to idols. My Talmud, and what do we mean? What does the pasuk mean? It means Amr Rav Chanan. It says Rav Chanan, al tifnu el midaitchem. Don't turn to something that you made up. In other words, as the Rambam interprets, it means don't turn to idolatry. And the Gemara is expanding this not just mentally, but it means physically. You're not even allowed to stare at these things. But this is a question. We're not going to go into this particular point so much. Maybe it's good that we should a little bit. But that's a question of like, what does it mean? You know how to look at it. You have to cover your eyes. You go to the Museum of Natural History, right? So they have totem poles. They have all these. You go to things by ancient Egypt or something. They have Avodah Zara over there. So you're not allowed to look at it. You have to mamish cover your eyes as you pass by. So there's a whole debate. There's a whole discussion. Does this mean maybe the prohibition is only an active idol. There's like an idol that's actually being served. Those things, totem poles, technically speaking in halacha, they're most likely not Avodah Zaras anymore because collectively they're batal. No one believes in them anymore, so this sort of humanity has been mevatel them from being Avodah Zara. So technically speaking, it's probably not an Avodah Zara anymore, but it definitely represents idolatry. So is this a prohibition of staring at an actual idol or just an image of an idol, so to speak? And also, when we talk about with mamish looking, is it to stare at it? So the usual consensus of the poskim is that just glancing at it, it's not a problem. You're passing by a church, whatever it is, and there's a cross. There's no prohibition necessarily of just happy to see it. You don't have to do tshuva for having seen a cross, But the poskim do say to stare at it and to really think about how it was made and like really to wow, like the architect was amazing when he did this. That's something that one should definitely avoid. Certainly if it's an active Avodah Zara. If it's not an active one, again, then it could be a little bit more lenient, but it's still, it's one of the Rishonim bring down part of this issue. We'll see soon the nature of this issur, but one aspect that the Rishonim bring down is that it's a waste of time. They have better things to occupy yourself with than worrying about totem poles, but that's what it is.
So doing little, like a nativity scene, theoretically becomes problematic, assuming the custom that it's
right. So that such a thing is not a chefetz of Avodah Zara. It represents idolatry. So, but it's not as far as staring at it and like.
But a Buddha statue would definitely be.
Avodah Zara mamish. That could be Avodah Zara mamish. Yes. So then definitely to avoid gazing on it. That's the Rambam. Now, what's interesting, the Rambam continues in Marmukah number 3. That's officially the Isser of Al Tifnu Alila. What's interesting is the Rambam uses now this as sort of a springboard to talk about other things that you're also not allowed to mentally engage in. So the Rambam says like this, Marmukah number 3. You should know that real Avodah Zara is not the only thing that you're not allowed to mentally turn towards and engage in. Says the Rambam, El kol machshavu shugarm leila adam la'akar ikar mikari hatayra. Any thought that is questioning or that might lead to undermining one of the principles of faith is also mizharin anu shleila leisa is also something we're prohibited from engaging in mentally. So the Rambam gives an example. First he says why. Why is that? Shadaita shalom katsar, because people. Listen, human beings are limited. We're not the most brilliant creatures that exist. And not everyone, through their own investigations, can get to the truth. So he says like this. So if you allow yourself to make your own investigations regarding fundamentals of faith, then you can end up messing your way of thinking up because you don't have. You might not get to the truth. You might not get to the real answer. Not because the real answer is not found, because you don't know the path to get there. So you don't have the kelim to do so. Ketzah. So he gives an example. So this guy is taking upon himself. He's going on a spatzir. He's thinking, I have some time to think. I'm going to contemplate whether is it really true that there is only one God. So and he thinks his lesson. It's one of the fundamentals of Yiddishkeit, and he wants to really investigate it. So he's going to allow himself to contemplate not the subject of Yichud Hashem. We talk about that in shul all the time, but in terms of like, let me investigate the veracity, the truth of it. Is it true or is it not true? And to allow me to rationalize and to sort of go through the cheshbon to try to come to the conclusion that he's trying to get to the right conclusion that there is one God, but he's going through this mental gymnastics. So Shamu Einai, let me allow myself to imagine that it's not true and to prove it to myself. So he says, or other thoughts, what's before creation, after creation, these types of thoughts, which again he's going into the sugya, l'shem shamayim. He wants to get to the correct answer, but he's allowing himself to start on sort of the negative side, and let me prove to myself, the truth. Upam b'navur. Let's say he's contemplating prophecy. Shemi emes, shemi eina. Let me start with a thought. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Let me figure out the truth of prophecy. Upam b'Torah, maybe Torah itself. Shemi min hashemayim, shemi eina. God forbid, maybe it's not from Har Sinai, and let me investigate. The Enya de Hamida, so the Rambam says very clearly, the Enya de Hamida is sheyodin behem. Every science has its own sort of set of rules, right? So if a person is an engineer, so there's a certain system that you have to, of rules and way of thinking that you have to have, tools to go into engineering. And those tools are good for engineering and not good for literature. And the tools that a literary, person, a writer would need to write poetry is not good for mathematics. Every system has its own set of rules. So Yiddishkeit and philosophy has the same thing as well. But this guy, he doesn't necessarily have those tools. So he's going, I'm going to investigate these in Yon. You're not coming with the right training. So says the Rambam, he doesn't have the tools through which to investigate these sugyas to get to the truth. The Nimsa gets to the Deminus, and because of this, he could end up messing himself up and coming to the wrong conclusions, God forbid, and uprooting from his own life one of the Ikari Emunah. And therefore, one should stay away from these subjects because most of us are not equipped to be able to handle those subject matters properly. And regarding this, the Torah warns us, don't go after your heart and eyes. In other words, after your eyes, we know that means znus, to watch your eyes. What does it mean to not to go after your heart? It means don't allow your heart to investigate subject matters that you're not equipped to handle. That no one should just allow themselves to go using their limited intellect and to think that you can do it. It's, not everyone is capable of doing that. So this is the Rambam. So the Rambam started off introducing us to this mitzvah that's called Atif Lilam, not to allow our thoughts to investigate the subject matter of idolatry, not even to study the statue itself. And then the Rambam said, and by the way, there's other subject matter you're not allowed to go into, which is basically apikarsis, subject matter. That's also prohibited. Maybe not from the same pasuk of Atif No Lilam, of Lois Asuru Achel Levavchem, but that's also subject matter you're not allowed to be involved in. That's the Rambam. Okay, so now the Rishonim bring up a very strong question, which is, what about the Rambam himself? The Rambam wrote a sefer called Mor Nevuchim. In Mor Nevuchim, there are two sections to Mor Nevuchim. And there's a number of sections, but basically there's two sections. First section of Mor Nevuchim is proving all the fundamentals of faith. There is one God, that he doesn't have a body, all the fundamentals of faith. And the way the Rambam does it is not by others, like other Svarim, the Kuzari, for example, the way the Kuzari goes about it is basically through tradition. These truths were revealed in Har Sinai, and that's where our tradition comes from. The Rambam doesn't go with that. The Rambam proves it philosophically, and that's where he's coming from. And then the other section of the Rambam is to give reasons for the 613. And a major source of explanation that the Rambam uses to explain many mitzvahs is based on his knowledge of the occult, based on his knowledge of idolatry. That there are certain things that were going on in the idolatrous world, and mitzvahs the Rebbeinu Shalom gave us were either to tear us away from those practices, or sometimes to give us a way to engage in those practices in a holy way, in a kosher way. There's many examples of this. So, for example, the Rambam, where does the Rambam put the halachas of payas in Mishnah Torah? Anyone know? The Rambam, where would you, if you're the Rambam, where in Mishnah Torah would you put the halachas of payas? Huh? So the Rambam puts it exactly in the halachas of Avodah Zara. Because the Rambam writes in Mor Nevuchim, why is it in Avodah Zara? So you learn Mishnah Torah, you don't know why is the Rambam putting it over there. So, but he doesn't. The order of the Rambam is not based on Chumash. So in Parashat Kedashim you have Kibbut Avein, all over the place. The Rambam puts it in Hilchos Avodah Zara because in Mor Nevuchim, the Rambam explains that the reason for the prohibition of cutting your payas is because by the priests of Avodah Zara that were going on by the times of Tanakh is that they did the opposite. They cut dafka the payas. So in order to be not like that, so we dafka grow our payas. So how do I know that? Because he read those books. That's the only way. It's the only way to know it, right? So the Rambam is telling us you're not allowed to engage, you're not allowed to read about Avodah Zara. And he says you're not allowed to also think about these cheshbainas, one God, maybe there is no one God, and to come to the truth through your own investigations. Both those things the Rambam seems to violate in Mor Nevuchim. So how do you deal with that? So let's go with the easier one first. The easier one to deal with is the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim investigating fundamentals of faith. Why is that easier to deal with? So take a look at Marmukah number 4. This is not my question. This is the Rishonim. There's a tshuva from the Rivash. The Rivash was one of the great Sfardish Paiskim. Tshuva Sfarim from the Rishonim already. From that base medrash of the Rashba. It's coming from that base medrash. He was a Talmud of a Talmud of the Rashba. So he's talking about over there. The question he was asked: is a person allowed to learn what's called Chachma Yavanis, Greek philosophy? That was the question. That's the tshuva that he's talking about. It's an important tshuva that's brought down with this subject. So over there he has a whole thing basically to say no, a person should not do it. And then he says like this: "Ve'ein lahavi rayim in a Rambam." He says, "I know what you're thinking. You think of the Rambam, right? The Rambam knew these things, you know." So he says, "Don't bring me a rayim from the Rambam." Why? Because before the Rambam started getting involved in these subject matters to prove that there's a one God, to prove that the world was created and the world didn't always exist, these types of inyanim. Before he investigated this, he already knew Kol Tarakul B'Shleimus, right? He knew all of Torah, Halachas, Agadas, Tesefta, Sefra, Sefri, Kuli, Talmud, Bavli, Yerushalmi. He says, "Kameishinir." He said, "For Mishnah Torah Shechiba." Look at the Mishnah Torah. You see the Rambam knew everything. So the Rambam knew all of that already before. And in order to deal with what Chazal say, that you should always be able to answer in Apikairis, that's why the Rambam wrote Sefer HaMayr, Moreh Nevuchim, Lister HaMaisim V'Harayish Evi HaPhilosoph, to combat some of the proofs that the world of philosophy were bringing, L'kiyam Kadmas Olam, that they were bringing to prove that the world always existed, things that are certainly against our tradition. So the Rambam had to learn those inyanim in order to deal with answering the apikarsis that was prevalent in his time. And because in his time many Yidden were taka confused in the fundamentals of Yiddishkeit because of this, because of what they learned from these other philosophies. So the Rambam had no choice but to sort of embrace this Inyan and Da'am al-Hashiv to respond to the apikaris. Okay, so what exactly is his answer? It's usher, but he had no choice. He knew Kol Tarakul anyway. Like, how does that help? Like, you know Kol Tarakul, you're still not allowed to eat treif. Like, if you're not allowed to do it, you're not allowed to do it. So it's Pekuch Nefesh. The answer is as follows. When in Marmukah number 3, when the Rambam talked about this prohibition of mentally investigating these subject matters, the Rambam made it very, very clear that the real issue is not because these subjects are off limits. His point is that the average person does not have the tools necessary to come to the proper conclusions. So the guy's going to investigate it, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't have the proper achanis and the proper akdam. It's not his inyan. So again, it's a mathematician trying to do open heart surgery. He's a brilliant guy, and he's good at what he does. He doesn't have the tools. He doesn't have the proper achanis. Doesn't have the training. So says the Rambam, that's the issue. That's the issue. That was clear. The Rambam kept on talking about that, which means that it's not a prohibition like that's mitzvah. It's not treif. The point is that for the average person, someone that doesn't really have the proper background, then this is a very serious concern because he doesn't have the tools. And so it's not kedai to get involved if you don't know what you're doing. It's kedai not to do the surgery. Leave it to someone that does. But if theoretically, that's what's clear in the Rambam, if it's theoretically true that you had someone that has the proper background, that understands what he's doing, then that's someone that maybe would be allowed to go into those things. Should they go into it? That's still debatable. But theoretically, they'd be allowed to. Therefore, says the Rivash, the Rambam had the background necessary. He was firmly rooted in Kol Tarakula. He was a brilliant person. He knew all the necessary components and rules and tools necessary to investigate these sugis properly. So he's allowed to do it, Aleph. And Beis, so should he do it? He had to because there were many Yidden that were falling away from Yiddishkeit because of these issues. So that's what the Rivash is trying to say. Again, that's why the Rambam in Mishnah Torah, the Rambam doesn't talk about the reasons for the mitzvahs. He just says the halachas. Over here, the Rambam talks about why there's the prohibition. Because the Rambam said, because if you investigate these things, you're going to end up messing yourself over because you don't have the tools. That's not just a reason for the mitzvah. That's how the mitzvah is formulated. It's not a prohibition because like something is treif. It's something that is just impractical, and it's very dangerous for the average person to do it simply because you don't have the proper background. If you had the proper background, maybe it's still not recommended, but if you think you have to because you have to save other Yidden, okay, then you're allowed to do it. And that's exactly what the Rambam is doing. So like I said, that side of the sugya is not so difficult to deal with. The bigger problem is the prohibition of investigating Avodah Zara. Understand that at that time by the Rambam, people were not worshiping these ancient Avodah Zaras anyway. So it's not a matter of like Pekuach Nefesh, like Yidden are falling for these for the Baal, you know what I mean? These ancient Avodah Zaras, no one's bowing down to Pa'ar. So it's not like there's an issue of Pekuach Nefesh over here. So what exactly is the heter for the Rambam to learn these things? Clearly he did, if that's the background that he used to explain Mishnah Torah. So it's like this. We do find, there's not an answer yet, but just to give a little bit of a Pesach, we do find one example in Chazal of where this prohibition of thinking about Avodah Zara and investigating those sugyas is permitted. And it's interesting. We don't have there's no clear source of why, but this is certainly something that Chazal had a tradition about. Take a look at Marmach number 5. This is a Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin. Okay, in the beginning of Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Beis of Hilchos Sanhedrin, the Rambam is talking about the qualifications that a person has to have in order to be a member of the Sanhedrin. So the Rambam says like this: Ein ma'amidin b'Sanhedrin, bein b'gedola, bein b'ktana. To be appointed to the Sanhedrin, whether the big Sanhedrin, 71 in Yerushalayim, or even the mini Sanhedrins throughout Eretz Yisrael of 23, right? Because the average Bezdin was of 3 people. When you had a Bezdin of 23, that they were able to deal with capital cases and so on. That was called the Sanhedrin. There's Sanhedrin Gedola, Yerushalayim, Sanhedrin Ketana throughout Eretz Yisrael. But to be a member of the Sanhedrin, again, whether Gedola or Ketana, you have to have the following qualifications: Ela Anoshim Chachamim Unuvainim, whatever that means, Chachamim Unuvainim, wise. Muflagim B'Chacham Satorah Baal Edeim Ruba, not just knowledgeable in Torah. Muflagim, Haflaga means like almost exaggerated. Like when you want to say in Hebrew an exaggeration, you say it's never muflag. Like muflagim B'Chachma, we're talking about like beyond the normal scope, not just a knowledgeable person. Almost believable. Bali Ruba, extremely deep thinker. Now, fine, that's as far as learning is concerned. Now, other subjects. Yoidim Ksas Mishar Chachmas. They also have to be people that are aware, at least somewhat, of other wisdoms. Kegayin Refuas, you have to know about medicine. Those are things that might come up with halacha. Sharas of Pekuach Nefesh come to them. They have to know about medicine. The Cheshvan, they have to know mathematics. Tekufas, Mazolis, they have to know about constellations. Again, these are things necessary for Kiddush HaChodesh, Kiddush Levana, for leap years, things like this. They also have to be expert in Avodah Zara, in the occult, in witchcraft, these types of subjects also. In order they should know how to paskin when shals come to them regarding these subjects. So now you have an interesting thing. You are a member of the Sanhedrin, and to be a member of the Sanhedrin means you have to be able to handle anything that comes on your desk. So something that comes on your that might come on your desk is this Avodah Zara? You know, like years ago, if you remember, this is already old news. But remember, like the Sheikhs wrote the Sheikh, right? So if you had a real Sanhedrin, and a part of a Sanhedrin, says the Rambam, is to understand these are other religions, then it would have been very, very simple and straightforward. He would have asked the question. He would say, no, in that religion, that thing, it's not Avodah Zara Dekeni. Okay, and that'll be it. But because there's a lack of knowledge in that, so things become a little bit confused over time. Okay, fine. So the member of the Sanhedrin have to know that. But what's interesting is that there is a prohibition of learning those things. You know what I mean? So it is an interesting thing. So there is an Isser of Al Tifnu El Ulidim. And if you remember, the Rambam didn't say that it's only usser to do it for the purposes of serving. You're doing it, for whatever reasons you want, and there's just an issue of being involved in those sugyas. And what we're seeing is, again, we have to explain why, but what we're seeing is at least that there is an opening, there is a heter. If you remember the Sanhedrin, evidently, in order to be able to pass in the Shaila and learning about these things is going to be permitted. Okay, we have to figure out how or why. But to be able to get to a better understanding of why this prohibition is permitted for the Sanhedrin, and why the Rambam was allowed to do it in order to write Mar Nevuchem. So we have to better identify the nature of this Isser. Okay, so let's better identify. So to appreciate the nature of this Isser of Al-Tifn Al-Ilam, of not investigating subject matter of Avodah Zara, again, the nature of the prohibition of not investigating or not, going through your own, cheshbainis of fundamentals of faith, that we learned already what the nature of the Isser is. The nature of the Isser is, you might not know what you're talking about. You might not know how to handle those subjects. So it's not Kedai. But what's the nature of this prohibition of getting involved with thinking and learning about Avodah Zara? So to appreciate that, we have to go back a little bit. So go back to Marmukah number 1. This is the first halacha in the second parak of Avodah Zara. So this is how the Rambam opens up the parak. I mentioned that the first parak is all about the history of Avodah Zara, right? Where it comes from, the mistake that Enosh made to serve the intermediaries. Says the Rambam like this: Ikar Hatziva b'Avodas Kechavim. The fundamental, the essential commandment regarding Avodah Zara is the following: not to serve anything that is created. That's pretty much Avodah Zara. And he says as follows: and again, this even if the person that's serving, that's doing the Avodah Zara, knows that the Rebbeinu Shalom is the Rebbeinu Shalom. And the only reason why this person is serving this malach, or serving this sun, or serving the moon, or whatever it is al derech she'aved Enosh v'anshei dara. The person's doing the same cheshbon that Enosh did in that generation. Of like, we know God is God, but L'maisa, didn't God give unbelievable power to the sun? So it's respectful for God if I serve the sun. The same mistake Enosh did. If a person does that, that's Avodah Zara. That's Avodah Zara. The Inyan Zeh, says the Rambam, and specifically this type of mistake, of not just Stam Avodah Zara, but doing the Avodah Zara of Enosh, which is to serve an intermediary, says the Rambam, Hu Shezir Torah Olav, there's a specific prohibition against that. For Amra, that the Pasuk says, Upenti Seinach HaShamayim, that maybe you'll turn your eyes to heaven, V'Re'isas HaShamesh, and you'll see the sun, and you'll see all that stuff. Ashechol Kashem Lakecha Eisam L'chol Am, and you're going to say, well, God gave these bodies power over the world. In other words, and you might make the cheshbon of, well, therefore they're worthy of my respect. You're going to say, oh, the sun, moon, God put them in such positions of authority. The timer, and you're going to say, that it's worth to serve them and to bow down to them and so on. So the pasuk then commands and says, don't turn your heart. Don't turn your heart to that. Says the Rambam Koloimer. Now says the Rambam the interesting thing. The prohibition is not just not to do it. The prohibition is shleititu behir halev lavid elu liyos sirser benechem benebari. Don't make that mental mistake. Don't, and certainly don't act upon it. But don't allow yourself to go there mentally. Don't allow yourself to think like that. That there's a God, but he's way out there, and these are intermediaries that are kedai to serve. Don't do it, but don't allow yourself to think like that.
Don't entertain that thought.
Don't entertain that thought. Don't entertain that thought. Those are the words. Shleititu b'hir halev. Don't be mistaken with the thoughts of your heart. Lavid elu, to serve them. Liyos sirsa benechem benebari, to be an intermediary between you and God. In that context, then the Rambam continues in Malacha Beis, what we saw before, that there are many books, Svarim Rabim, Chikro, Evdei, that there's many books about the occult. And the Rambam says, and you're not, and as we saw before, those subject matters are also off limits to your mind. Take a look now at the last line of Marmukah number 2. Says the Rambam, V'chol halavin ha'elu, and all these prohibitions that I've mentioned, the inyan echadheim, they're all fundamentally one yesod, one fundamental principle, which is don't turn towards Avodah Zara. So what did the Rambam just do now? The Rambam just said an interesting thing. The Rambam listed a bunch of different prohibitions. The Rambam first in Parak Aleph gave us a whole history lesson of Avodah Zara. Fine. Then comes chapter 2, and the Rambam says in Halacha Aleph of chapter 2, even if a person serves something as an intermediary between you and God, that's Avodah Zara, and don't allow yourself to think like that. And then the Rambam said, and also, just the entire subject matter of Avodah Zara is just off limits. Learning about what they did, learning about how they're served by other people, but just that whole subject matter is off limits. Says Raman, everything I just mentioned is one inyan, which is don't turn towards Avodah Zara. So what's the Nakuda? The Nakuda is as follows. The Rambam is telling us that there's one fundamental yesod that is the nucleus of all of these prohibitions that he just mentioned, of not serving intermediaries, of not thinking like that, of not studying in academically Avodah Zara, even if you don't believe in it. It's one yesod. Don't give it roots. Don't give it a foundation. It doesn't exist. Don't give it a mitzias. Don't be machshav it. It doesn't have any roots. If a person, the fundamental prohibition is to give a shirish to Avodah Zara, to give a shirish to it. Now, what does it mean to give a shirish to something? What does it mean to give something legs, and to give something an anchor, to give something a place to stand on? So you can do that in many ways. By even studying the subject matter and to get degrees in it, that's already making it a zach. Not a zach that I believe in per se. You're making it a zach. You're giving it a shirish. And by the way, the concept is once something has a shirish, it can flourish, it can grow, it can develop. Don't give it a shirish. How do you give it a shirish? So the Torah says one way of giving it a root is by studying it even academically. That's one way of giving it a root. And there's another way of giving it a root, which is believing in the concept of intermediaries. Because that's also a root that idolatry came from. Like that's exactly what all of chapter 1 is about. Chapter 1 is about establishing what's the root of Avodah Zara. That's exactly what is the root of Avodah Zara? Real Avodah Zara is this is a God. But that didn't just come out of nowhere. That came from a root. The root of it was believing and having this mindset of that there's something noble about serving or giving credence to intermediaries between you and God. That's the root of Avodah Zara. Says the Rambam, not only is Avodah Zara off limits, but the ikar inyan of Avodah Zara is not to give it a shirish. Undermine its roots, uproot it. How do you uproot it? From your own heart, from reality, from the world, is by avoiding the subject matter b'chalal, and more than that, and as well, not allowing certainly the origins of the Zara to take root in your own life, not to fall into the mistakes of Dar Enosh. So this is the fundamental yesod, which is not to give it a root, or now let's go a little bit deeper into the pneumius of this inyan, to take away the very mitzias of Avodah Zara. The shirish of Avodah Zara means that it doesn't. That the root of Avodah Zara means that it could possibly have a mitzias. Let's put it this way: whatever fertile ground could be for Avodah Zara, take away that fertile ground. There's no fertile ground for Avodah Zara. Now let's define for ourselves now in pneumistic language, what is the pneumistic root of Avodah Zara? So it's all revolving on this pasuk of Al Tifnu El Elilim, right? Now it's interesting. That word Elilim is a very rare, it's not a common word for Avodah Zara. The usual word for Avodah Zara is Elohim Acherim, things like that, or Avodas Kechavim Mazals. What is Elilim? So you know what the word Elilim means? If you take a look at Maramokah number 6, Rashi, on that Gemara, when the Gemara said you're not allowed to read, the thing underneath the thing, but the thing itself, right, the statue itself, or the Zara itself, you're not allowed to even look at. Look, we're not going to get too much involved in the sheet of Rashi, particularly in that Gemara, but look at how Rashi teaches the word Elilim. Rashi says, El midaitchem, El asher ta'oisem midas levavchem, l'chalal sholachem. Alilim lashon chalalim. Says Rashi, the word alilim, which means idols, it comes from the word chalal. In Hebrew, there's certain letters which can be interchanged with each other. Aleph and ches can be interchanged. Elilim can be read chalilim or chalalim. Chalalim means, literally, a chalal means an empty space. So in other words, what's Rashi saying? The word alilim, why does it mean Avodah Zara? It's empty. It's a shtus. It's narish. It's a vacuum. It's meaningless. But in Pneumius, whenever you see that word halal, it always has to trigger to you. Halal, I know what halal means. Halal miyodea, right? Halal niyodea. What did that Rizal say? The Rizal says, before creation, what was there? Ein Sof, just the light of the infinite one. No, but as I mentioned many times, if all there is God, then there's no room for anything else. So Rabbanan Shalom, but Hashem wants it to be a world. So Rabbanan Shalom, therefore created this funny reality. The Rabbanan Shalom, Kiviyachol, the Rizal describes, made an empty space. An empty space. This Chalal HaPanah, that's the language, a Chalal HaPanah, empty space. In this empty space, you know, there's God's presence is not there, Kiviyachol. So now in this empty space, you could have great things. You could have Beis HaMikdash. You could have tzaddikim. You could have yidden. You could have non-Jews l'avdil. You could have bad things too. But the root upon which all of reality is existing, the shirish of all of it, is what is the chalal upon is the empty space. Al tifnu el alilim. Al tifnu el alilim. What's the shirish of Avodah Zara? See, even by Dar Enish, right? What was Dar Enish? Dar Enish was God is way out there. And because God is way out there, so I don't feel much of a connection to this God. So what I do feel a connection to is the sun I get. Mm-hmm. And God created the sun, so I'm going to serve the sun. The very philosophy of Enosh is rooted on taking extremely literally and extremely seriously this idea of there being an empty space. It's the empty space itself that is the fertile ground for many good things. All good choices that you can make, but understand that in the deepest sense, the very existence, the very thought that the Chalal HaPanah, that this empty space is absolute, is the root of Avodah Zara. Not only is the root, what is Avodah Zara? Avodah Zara is that there's something that's not God, something that has its own independent powers. That not only comes because of this phenomenon of the empty space, that is believing in the empty space. Mm-hmm. To believe in the Chalal HaPanah means that God is beyond that bubble, and in this bubble, what's left? Us, with our limited strength and our limited weaknesses and all that stuff, our limitations. But we exist in this empty space as independent creatures. Thus is Avodah Zara. That's the chefts of Avodah Zara. That's the shorsh of Avodah Zara. The pneumius of this prohibition is what? In the real pneumius of this prohibition is al tifnu el alilim. Don't fully believe in the emptiness of the Chalal HaPanah. That's the pneumius of this mitzvah. That's the pneumius of it. Take a look at Marmukah number 7. In the Chut Maran, Chelik Aleph Siman Samach Dal. It's a very, very Yisraelistic piece. And he says the following thing. Hine, Ayidei Amuna. So Rabbi Nachman, in that piece, we don't have the time anymore to go through the whole Indian. Rabbi Nachman basically sets up for us a very difficult, philosophical challenge, which is we have to believe in this phenomenon of there being an empty space within which we can function as independent people, because otherwise, then everything is before creation and everything is the Rabbanan Shalom, there's no us. But yet, at the same time, it's not possible to say that God doesn't exist in this place either, because that means that you're limiting the Rabbanan Shalom Kiviyachol. That you can't do. The Zohar says that the Rabbanan Shalom surrounds all things and is within all things. So you can't. So Mamanoshach, you can't say that there is an empty space. You can't say there is no empty space. You're sort of stuck. So Rabbi Nachman, classic in the way of Chassidus, doesn't necessarily tell us what the answer is, but he tells us how to react to it. And so says Rabbi Nachman like this: Hine adei amuna, through amuna, shema'aminim sha'Hashem yisbarach ma'malek kol almin v'sayev kol almin. Through faith. Faith is the way through which we're able to navigate through this paradox of there, yes, is an empty space, but at the same time, the empty space is not so empty. Through believing the Rabbanan Shalom fills all worlds and surrounds all worlds, and in truth of all truths, Yesham Elokus Yisbarach, the Rabbanan Shalom's presence is there, but at the same time, not undermining the existence of the empty space. And that's the paradox of it. Because in our way of thinking, if the Rebbeinu Shalom is there, it's not empty. And then nothing happened from before creation. Elamai, he's not there. So it's really empty then. But for it to be an empty space and still be full of God's presence, like either the cup is full or it's not full, like which one is it? So we can't compute such a thing. But that's where Emunah comes from, which is that it's both, that it is a Chalal Panoi, but it's not empty. It's a full empty space. That's the secret of Emunah. So he says, it's impossible to be mastig, for us to process it, almost as if, as far as we're concerned, it's as far as our experience is empty, despite the fact that it's not, and our experience is also true. Again, a paradox. The lim say Shem Hashem Yisparach, and to find Hashem there. Al Kain, and through Emunah, we're able to withstand all the problems and difficulties and kashas and so on that might be coming from this paradox. Because that's the bigger context of that piece over there. Rabbi Nachman talks about certain kashas and certain difficulties in life that are coming because of the very fact that there has to be some emptiness to allow there to be a you. Because there has to be a barrier, so to speak, between you and God, so to speak. So automatically it means that you're going to be not God, which means you're not going to be perfect, and life is not going to be perfect. So there are certain imperfections in life because of your mistakes, and because of the things that you messed up, or other people mess up, for you. But there are also imperfections in life and in you, just because of the fact that you're not God. And so those imperfections, you're not going to be able to overcome, because guess what? You're not God. So there are certain inyanim that we deal with just because of the fact that there is an empty space. But at the same time, as Yidden, you can't fully believe in the emptiness of that empty space. So so how do we deal with those imperfections, with those kashas in life? So that's what Rabbi Nachman in this piece is talking about, that we transcend the questions. We somehow become big enough people to handle those imperfections and to handle those kashas. Not necessarily are those questions answerable, and not necessarily are those problems fixable. Problems that are coming because of bad decisions in the empty space you can fix. But the difficulties that are coming because of the reality of the empty space, that you can't fix. But you can become big enough to handle it. That's what Rabbi Nachman is talking about in this piece. That's what Rabbi Nachman says. Let's go back. So the Rambam, again, in halacha, that's again always halacha tying into Pimius. The Rambam defined for us that in halacha there is this one prohibition. This prohibition that contains within it not believing in the philosophy of Enosh and not studying Avodah Zara academically. And what was the aside? Says the Rambam, the aside is don't give a shirish to Avodah Zara. Don't give it legs to stand on. Cut its legs from underneath it. Don't give it fertile ground to grow. Once you believe in the philosophy of Enosh, Avodah Zara can come from that. Even studying the occult in all of its details also can lead a person to start believing in it and start acting upon it. Don't give it a place. Don't give it a place in your heart. And so translating that in terms of Pnimius and broadening the definition of what Avodah Zara means. Avodah Zara doesn't just mean a totem pole or a chves or a cross. Avodah Zara means any independent power with its own sovereignty and its own independent existence. The deeper meaning of this prohibition is don't believe in the emptiness of the empty space. Al tifnu el halilin. That's what alila means, like Rashi said, the emptiness. In the simple taich, alila means, again, the emptiness, the narishkeit of Avodah Zara. But in a deeper sense, it means don't believe in the Chalal Hapanoi. Because if you believe fully in the Chalal Hapanoi, then what? Then dus is Avodah Zara. That's the root of what will lead to denying the Rebbeinu Shalom ultimately, because the Rebbeinu Shalom is not here. And so, but here's the catch-22. You can't fully just ignore the emptiness of the Chalal Hapanoi, because then there's no you. Mm-hmm. So you have to sort of have a munah to handle this, which is to believe that the empty space is in fact not empty. And that's the aside of this mitzvah, al tifnu el halilin. Because of this, now Rabbi Nachman continues, because of this, the general reaction or the general relationship that the average Yid has to this Chalal Hapanoi is one of emunah. That's what Rabbi Nachman said, because to truly grapple with it is impossible for the average person and dangerous to the average person, and therefore the reaction is one of al tifnu al ulidim. Don't try to investigate this sugya because it's not something that the human can comprehend. Rather, the avodah is amuna to try to transcend it, to try to handle the wrenches that will be thrown your way because of this mitzias of elilim. But al tifnu el elilim. Don't believe in the emptiness of the empty space. And what does that mean? It means to react to it with amuna. That's the mitzvah.
What's the amuna in? The amuna that what?
That despite the fact that nothing makes sense, that what's coming my way or what's coming this person's way is not something that I deserve, not something that I did, not something that anyone can answer. Despite all of that, I still believe in the Bari Olam's love for me. I still believe in the Bari Olam's perfection and in the world that he created as being a perfect place, as being a good place. So all these, the types of kashas that might be generated from the Chalal Panei are questions which are experiences which make a person question God's God's plan for this place, right? Because one of the things, if you fully believe in the emptiness of the Chalal Panei, it means that now we're left to our own devices and we could royally mess this place up, which means that God's plan of creation might not work out. And so you read the Sadaris and you see things going haywire, you're thinking to yourself, okay, maybe this entire, gamble of the Rebbeinu Shalom by creating a world might not work out for him. That's right. So that itself, right, the failed experiment of creation. So that itself is a question that comes because of the Chalal Panei. And a person has to have a munah to overcome that, which is that it's not true you might mess that up so much. And we have Bechira to do that, but at the same time, God's world is perfect.
What about the main question is God here in his full sense?
That's the thing. The answer is, so the average Jew can't conceptualize an answer, but we can viscerally experience the Rebbeinu Shalom being here and not at the same time. This is a side that I've mentioned many, many times in Chassidus, that one of the deepest spiritual satisfactions of the soul is looking for the Rebbeinu Shalom. And there's a satisfaction in that. That stira of being spiritually satisfied in looking for the Rebbeinu Shalom is touching upon this truth of the empty space not being empty. Because looking for the Rebbeinu Shalom means there's an emptiness here that you're looking for something, but that's satisfying as if it's not empty. This is what davening is. This is what Torah is supposed to be. This is a core, fundamental yesod in understanding the experience of the neshama through Avodah Hashem in the context of Avodah Hashem. It's a very, very core point. But that's the reaction. So the nature of this prohibition of al tifnu al ulim, which means the empty space is not empty. That's what al tifnu al ulim means. But what is that like? What does that mean practically? What does that mean for us? How do I establish that the empty space is not empty? So for the average Jew, that's not going to be through an intellectual pursuit. It can't be through an intellectual pursuit. The mind is not capable of grasping that. The reaction of a Jew, the way the average Jew fulfills this mitzvah, is, as we just said, is by having the emunah to deal with the difficulties that come from the empty space and reacting with faith, which is basically saying that I acknowledge the emptiness of the empty space, but at the same time, God is there and I have faith in him. So that's the way how the average Jew deals and fulfills this mitzvah of al tifnu al ulim. But that's for the average Jew. Says Rabbi Nachman, the last couple lines, Ach da'aba, you should know, in yesh tzadik gadol shu b'chinas Moshe, there is such a thing as a tzaddik in the level of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he fulfills the mitzvah al tifnu al ulim more than just a way of handling the things, the ramifications of the empty space. He is not only able to, he's commanded. His way of fulfilling al tifnu al ulim is more head on, and he actually investigates this inyan of there being an emptiness and yet God being there, and somehow is able, as a Moshe Rabbeinu, to somehow find the Rebbeinu Shalom in the emptiness, despite the fact that it's still empty. What for the average Jew is conceptually impossible, and it's just a matter of how to handle that reality experientially, the Moshe Rabbeinu is able to be masig such an inyan and to investigate it to whatever degree is possible. And even if Moshe Rabbeinu can't ultimately get to the ultimate conclusion, but by his investigation in that sugya, to whatever degree he's able to, that he'll be rescuing neshamas that were not Moshe Rabbeinu's, that maybe fell into those emptinesses, and he's going to rescue them through his investigation. So again, what Rabbi Nachman is telling us over here is that there are two categories of Yidden and two approaches, two madregas of how to deal with this reality of the empty space and yet not being empty. So for the average Yid, this truth of the empty space not being empty is not something that the average Jew can truly intellectually investigate or even spiritually comprehend, but it's something that's just a matter of how to have a munah to handle what comes from the empty space. That's one reaction. And then Rabbi Nachman said, but the tzaddik of Moshe Rabbeinu, his relationship is one that he gets involved and he investigates and he does the best he can to try to be masig this side of the empty space being empty and not empty at the same time. In the piece of Rabbi Nachman, it's just floating in this concept, but giving it roots in halacha. What we're seeing is that the mitzvah that this entire Torah of Rabbi Nachman is revolving around the mitzvah al tifnu alilim, because the mitzvah al tifnu alilim is don't fully believe in the empty space. Al tifnu alilim, don't give fertile ground for Avodah Zara. Undermine its roots. Undermine the empty space within which Avodah Zara can flourish. Undermine that. What does it mean? It means there is no empty space? No, it means the empty space is not empty. How do you fulfill this mitzvah? So that's what Rabbi Nachman said. There's two types of Yid. One Yid fulfills the mitzvah by what? By, I don't get it, but at least I have a munah to handle it. And another type of Yid fulfills that mitzvah by investigating and somehow grappling with the emptiness and despite the fact that it's empty, making it not empty at the same time. How do those two paths express themselves halachically in terms of the mitzvah al tifnu alilim? The answer is, there's one side of al tifnu alilim which is, like the Rambam said, don't think about the occult, don't investigate it, don't allow yourself to go there. That is the way the average Yid fulfills the mitzvah al tifnu alilim. But if you're a Moshe Rabbeinu, then the way you fulfill al tifnu alilim is not by ignoring it. The way you fulfill al tifnu alilim is by investigating the inyan of the empty space, but incorporating it in, but making it not empty. Right? The empty space is not empty. What does it mean practically? It means taking the sugya of Avodah Zara, which is emptiness, right? Your own, something that's its own power, not, a false god, the emptiness, and making it a sugi in Torah. What is Torah? God's light. So by investigating the sugyas of Avodah Zara and incorporating it into Torah, that's how the Moshe Rabbeinu fulfills the mitzvah of tifnu alilim. You understand? It's by That's exactly how the Moshe Rabbeinu Dikin Hashemis fulfills the mitzvah of tifnu alilim. When the Rambam said that al tifnu alilim means don't think about Avodah Zara, it's off limits, it's not gonna die. That's the way the average Yid fulfills the mitzvah of tifnu alilim. Because again, what's the side of tifnu alilim? What's the pneumius? What's the soul of the mitzvah? The side of the mitzvah is make the empty space not empty. But for the average Jew, that could only be done. And again, so the empty space means Avodah Zara. That's the empty space. That's the alilim. Not empty, God's light means Torah. So for the average Jew, the average Jew cannot conceptualize the empty space being not empty. So for the average Jew, the sugya of Avodah Zara is just b'chlal off limits. The only way that we can fulfill that mitzvah is by just dealing with it and by staying away from Avodah Zara and being good boys and girls in terms of dealing with having a munah to deal with kashas that come from that empty space. But if you're a Moshe Rabbeinu Dikin Neshama, then the way you fulfill the mitzvah of Tiflim is hands-on, by undermining the emptiness of the empty space, but by keeping it empty at the same time, which means, practically, it means taking the sugyas of Avodah Zara and making them a part of Torah. That's exactly what the Sanhedrin were doing. The Sanhedrin were learning the halachas of the occult because they had to. So they had to, because you have to pass in the Shiloh. When the Shiloh comes, you'll investigate it then. No, as a prerequisite to be a member of Sanhedrin, you had to know the sugas of the occult and how to pass in the Shiloh because of it. Why is that a prerequisite? The answer is because, as I mentioned many, many times, the Yisod Sanhedrin is a hemshech of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is Shakal Keneged Ayin Aleph. Moshe Rabbeinu was a walking Sanhedrin. I mentioned this one of the shiurim one day. I think it was like on a holiday or something. So we talked about this Indian that there was a member, 71 members of the Sanhedrin, but there was a 72nd that his job, says the Rambam, was to represent Moshe. Means the entire inner Sanhedrin is Moshe Rabbeinu. So of course the Sanhedrin is going to be obligated in Al Tifna Alilim to engage in the subject matter of Avodah Zara, but to incorporate into the context of Torah, because that's what's doing. What they're doing is, there is an empty space, that's called Avodah Zara, but it's not empty, it's part of Torah. Because that's what Sanhedrin does, the Rambam, who is also Bechina of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Moshe ad Moshe is like Kamka Moshe. So Moshe, the Rambam, who is the Bechina of Moshe Rabbeinu in his generation, so of course the Rambam also fulfills the mitzvah of Tifna Alilim by what? By incorporating the halachas, the rituals of Avodah Zara in the context of Torah in the Mar Nevuchim. So what comes out by understanding the themes of this Inyan is not the Rambam disregarded this prohibition for the sake of Pekuch Nefesh, helping of the Adra. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu Dik Neshomas fulfill this mitzvah Tifna Alilim. So again, the Yisrael Tifna Alilim is undermine the root of Avodah Zara. What is Avodah Zara? Avodah Zara is the empty space. Undermine its existence. It's not empty? No. That it's empty and not empty at the same time. The average Yid can't do that actively. The average Yid can only do that through deepening your general emunah. And to deepen your general emunah means to stay away from those subjects. But by the Moshe Rabbeinu Dik Neshomas, no. That's how they fulfill the mitzvah more proactively, which is to engage in Avodah Zara, not the Avodah Zara mamish, but to engage in these subject matters in the context of Torah learning. And in the context of Torah learning, it means that the empty space is not empty. That's the side of Al Tifna Alilim. No, Hashem should help us. Should be Makash ourselves to Nishmas Moshe in every generation, and from there we'll be able to see how the empty space is not empty.